Hi and welcome to the video. The Nikon AFS 200-500mm f5.6 with image stabilization or VR was a very popular lens for many wildlife and especially bird photographers because it offers this kind of flexibility of a zoom. You still get up to 500mm of focal length. The size and weight is quite reasonable and it's actually quite affordable. And I have seen it coupled quite often with a D500 or D850, but nowadays also adapted to the new mirrorless cameras such as the Z8 or Z9. And now Nikon has released its successor specifically designed for mirrorless cameras, the Nikkor Z180-600mm f5.6 to 6.3, obviously with image stabilizer as well. And as the name already suggests, you have now less focal length on the short end, more focal length on the long end compared to the 200-500. So this gives you a bigger zoom range and more flexibility, at least in theory. So sounds amazing. There is also quite some changes with the haptics and how the lens is constructed. So in this video I want to talk about my impressions that I had with this lens after using it for a bit more than a week, direct comparison shots to the 200-500mm lens, and finally also my verdict and to whom I would recommend this lens and to whom maybe not. So let's start with some specifications and differences in the handling of the two lenses. And here first of all, a big thanks to Nikon that gave me this new lens to test for around 10 days, and to Nicole Watkins, a young nature photographer from Switzerland. She has some amazing images. Please check out her website. So thanks that I could use this lens as a comparison. It was really a last minute decision, so thanks that I could have it. So if we have a look at the dimensions of the lens, the new lens is a bit longer. It's 31.6 centimeters long, whereas this one is only 26.5. However, we need to keep in mind that in order to use this lens on a mirrorless camera, we need this adapter, this FTZ adapter. So if we include this in the calculations, this is around 3 centimeters. The difference between the two is only 2 centimeters. The diameter of the lens is fairly similar. It's 10.7 to 11 centimeters. So I don't think this one will take more space in your backpack, especially since the lens hood, if you put it reversely on the camera, actually seems a bit smaller of the 180-600. So I definitely appreciate this. The next important point is the weight. So the old one comes in at 2.3 kilograms, the new one 2.14. So we have some weight reduction here. I prefer again to calculate the weight that you actually have when you use the lens. This means with lens hood, with a tripod collar, and again here with the adapter. And then the difference of the two lenses gets a bit bigger. So here we have a working weight of 2.54 kilograms, whereas here it's at 2.27. So a bit more than 250 grams of difference. It's not huge, but you definitely notice it when handling it. So definitely welcome that the new one is lighter. In terms of the diameter of the filter thread, this is exactly the same. It stays at 95mm, so you can carry them over to your new lens. The minimum focus distance is variable on this lens, so it's ranging from 1.3 meters at 180mm to 2.4 meters if you're shooting at 600mm. Here it's fixed at 2.2 meters, no matter at which zoom setting you are. And the maximum magnification is a bit better with the new one, so it's just more suited if you take some casual shots of dragonflies, amphibians, reptiles and so on. It's 1:4, whereas here it's 1:4.5. So one reason why this lens is longer is certainly that you can zoom until 600mm, and the second thing is that it's an internal zoom. So meaning if I switch here from 180 to 600mm, the length of the lens stays exactly the same, which has some great advantages for weather sealing, and it can also have some advantages if you use it on a gimbal, because it means that the front element of the lens stays at the same place, and therefore the weight distribution is not changing so much. I need to say I don't know how big of a deal this is because I didn't use this on a tripod except for the test shots, just because they're so easy to handhold. But here you can see it extends quite a bit if I zoom to 500mm. And also, if I hold it like this for shooting, I have trouble to quickly zoom out to 200mm. I need to like do it in 2 turns, which is maybe not a problem if you have a deer that is slowly approaching and you're constantly adjusting the zoom or something. But if you shoot some pictures at, let's say, 200mm of a swan or a goose, and then you want to quickly zoom in for taking a portrait shot and you go to the 500mm, then it just takes much longer. And here, I would say it's even a bit less than a 90-degree turn. So no matter in which position I am, I can easily do this just with even one finger. And that's it's a big improvement that I really noticed in the field. Another difference between the two lenses is that this one doesn't have so many switches, and that's a general trend we see with the Z lenses from Nikon, that all image stabilizer related things are now done in camera. I prefer to have them on the lens, to be honest, but this is personal preference and it's also not a big deal. So here you just have the autofocus manual focus switch and then the focus range that you can set to everything, to the full range, or 6 meters to infinity. What is definitely a nice addition is here in front the lens function button. For example, I put the spot autofocus on this one, but you can program it to do pretty much everything you want. Then you have the zoom ring, as I mentioned, works very nice. And here the focus ring, which is a bit small if I look at it, but actually I never had any problems using it in the field. Also, it's very well positioned. What this lens lacks maybe compared to some other lenses like a Z400mm f4.5 is a control ring. Again, for me, not a big deal. I was not using it anyway, but I just wanted to mention it at this point. Another important thing to mention is definitely the price. So obviously this is a brand new lens, so it's more expensive. At the moment it costs around $1,700 whereas this one is $1,400. I need to say, when I checked the US prices, I was surprised how small the difference is. In Europe, the difference is more around 800 euros, which is maybe something like $700. I'm not aware of the exact exchange rate, but in Europe the difference between the two is much bigger. So let's move to the topic you probably all have waited for, and that's image quality. So I first did some test shots at home of this little toucan friend I have from Costa Rica. I placed it like 8.5 to 9 meters in front of me. I focused on the eye. I did everything from the tripod with a 5-second timer, a VR turned off. So there should not be any issue with the autofocus. There should not be any issue with the vibrations, camera shake, and so on. So you can here first see an overview of the scene starting at 200mm at f5.6 for both lenses. And what I feel we already see in this overview is that the new 180-600 has slightly less vignetting than the old 200-500, but the difference is not huge. So let's zoom in the middle. And here I feel like the 180-600 is ever so slightly sharper. So it's noticeable, but not a big difference. However, if we move to the edge of the frame, and you can see that I put the toucan quite at the edge of the frame, and we zoom in, here the difference is more noticeable. The new 180-600 is definitely an improvement over the 200-500. If we go back to the center of the image, but stop down to f8, so one stop down, we stop down by one stop, we see that the 200-500 improves. I would say the 180-600 improves as well, but the 200-500 really manages to almost close the gap. Now the differences are really not that big anymore. If we move to the edge of the frame, we see the same picture, that now the difference one stop down is much smaller between the two. Let's go to the next focal length, which is 300mm, and here you have like an f6 with the 180-600, but this you cannot even set with the 200-500. So I went to the largest aperture I could set with both lenses, exactly the same, and this was 6.3. And here you can see a huge difference. I mean, the 180-600 is so much sharper, and it gets even more pronounced if we go to the edge of the frame, where the 180-600 is still holding up very well, whereas the 200-500 really looks mushy and, in my opinion, not usable anymore. If we stop down to f8, the 200-500 definitely improves, but the 180-600 is still clearly better. And once again, if we move to the edge, actually even the stopping down doesn't help to make the 200 to 500 look sharp, or for me this is not even acceptable sharp. So here we see a huge improvement with the new lens. Let's move to 500 millimeters, because I think this is where many of you will be using this lens. And to my surprise, the gap is really closing here. We have them both at f6.3, and there is not a huge difference. The Z180-600 is sharper, but it's not a crazy difference. If we move to the edge of the frame, there the difference is a bit more pronounced, and we also see chromatic aberrations on the 200 to 500 on the old lens, a bit on the neck of the toucan. We see this magenta type of colors, and on the white to black border of the toucan we see more greenish colors. If we stop down to f8 and go back to the center of the image, the 180-600 is still a bit sharper, but again the difference is not crazy, and I definitely would have no trouble shooting with the 200 to 500 here. And if we stop down at the edge of the frame as well, we see that the 200 to 500 improves, but the 180-600 still has the edge. So this is the longest focal length that kind of both lenses share. The 180-600 can obviously go to 600 millimeters, and I think many of you sometimes want more focal lengths. So I went to 600 millimeters on the 180-600, and on the 200 to 500 I stayed at 500, and I just cropped the image a bit. I think in reality this is what many people do in the end if they want a bit more reach. And here I need to say I was pleasantly surprised how well the cropped 200 to 500 millimeter image was holding up. It's not as detailed as the 180-600 millimeter, but I was expecting a bigger difference, at least here in the center of the image. If we go at the edge of the image, again the difference gets more pronounced. This is what we saw already before, and again stopping down helps maybe a tiny bit here in the center of the image, but in my opinion not even so much for the 200 to 500. So here the 180-600 is the winner, and at the edge of the image it manages to catch up a bit, but the 180-600 is clearly sharper here. Finally, if you want even more focal length, there is the 1.4 extender. It's the set version of the extender, so I could obviously only test it with the 180-600 millimeter. And here we can see that at f9, this is the open aperture, the largest aperture you can have at 840 millimeters. The sharpness is okay, but it seems a bit soft, and stopping down to f11 definitely helps. If we move at the edge of the image, yeah, it's a bit soft, and to be honest, stopping down at f11 doesn't seem to help so much. It's still just not the sharpness that you would maybe hope for, but from my experience, this is quite normal with zoom lenses, especially with zoom lenses that are not from the top of the line, because the Nikkor 180-600 is not an S lens. So I think these kind of studio tests are nice, but it's also important to talk about how they actually perform in practice. And here I try to make some comparison shots with in different situations, like low light, a lot of light, direct sunlight. And also I wanted to vary a bit with the shooting distance, because Nicole Watkins told me already 2 or 3 months ago that she was not happy at all with the performance of the 200 to 500 if you shoot at a long distance. And I did a quick test shot of a tree, and indeed on long distance the 180-600 is a lot sharper. I was mainly taking pictures of birds when comparing the two lenses, so this made it a bit harder to shoot on a really big distance. So the first subject I had was this moorhen here, and there was actually two. There was this fallen trunk in the water, and the first one walked over it. I managed to take some shots, and then I saw a second one coming like 30 seconds, 1 minute later, so just enough time to swap the lenses. So this means the distance was exactly the same, background was the same, and also the light was the same. So I think it's quite a fair comparison. I shot both lenses at 500mm, f6.3, and you can see the difference is really not big. I think it's basically impossible to tell which lens is which. Both performed very well. I also want to add that I took the sharpest shot of a series of shots, so this is the kind of the best that both of them performed. Then I did a second test a few days later when I was taking some pictures of smaller tits, and there I needed a bit more focal length. 500mm was not, I could have used a tiny bit more, to be honest. So I did also here some shots. Here the light might have changed a tiny bit, but I think it's still quite comparable. The distance was exactly the same. And here we can already see in the overview the difference between 500 and 600 millimeters. And not only in terms of how big is the bird in the frame, but also that with the 600 millimeter, the background is a bit smoother, which is often welcome, I would say. So if we zoom in to both shots, we see that both are quite sharp. I mean, I don't have complaints with any of the two shots. If we want to zoom a bit more into the lens and the shot that I took with the 200 to 500 to make it the same magnification as the shot that I took with the 100 to 600, we can see that now the 100 to 600 has a small edge, but to be honest, the differences are smaller than I expected. So to sum up, for the 200 to 500, it held up better than I expected in practice, especially probably since I was shooting rather on shorter distances and I was often having the subject a bit more centered in the image. If you go a bit more creative with the composition, work maybe with a smaller, put the bird or whichever animal a bit smaller in the frame and put it more towards the corners, you will see bigger differences. But here I was kind of happily surprised, but I need to say that the 180 to 600 seemed to perform a bit more constant, or it's a bit hard to describe, but I felt like there were more sharper shots with the 180 to 600. With the 200 to 500 it had a bit more soft shots, but overall it was holding up pretty well. For the 180 to 600 I was very happy with the sharpness, also that it was in most of the cases sharp, but both in consistency and in sharpness it was not reaching other lenses like a Z400mm f4.5, which might make sense because this is a zoom lens, it's not even an S lens, so yeah, I think it's clear that some other lenses win here, and the sharpness is totally acceptable and would for me be good enough in most of the cases. As I mentioned before, except for the sharpness tests, I have never used the lens on a tripod because I feel like with the weight of a bit more than 2 kilos, it's still very hand-holdable, and the image stabilizer is doing a fantastic job. I did not have the opportunity to do a one-to-one comparison to a 400mm f4 or a Z600mm f4, but it felt like on a more or less similar level. But I don't know about the nuances here. What I did test was a comparison to the 200 to 500mm, and I did my usual test setup. So I started with turning the image stabilizer off. I shot at 500mm with 1/50th of a second, and only 4% of the images were still really sharp. Then I tried the 200 to 500mm with image stabilizer on. There I got 91% sharp images, which actually surprised me for an adapted lens. I would have imagined a bit worse performance, so I was positively surprised. And still this one clearly was beating it. I managed to produce 99% of really tack sharp images at 1/50th of a second at 500mm, which I think is an excellent value. And in retrospect, I should maybe have done the test at 1/25th of a second. I was also very happy with the overall autofocus performance of this lens. So not being a Z lens, it has a step autofocus motor, but still I felt it was very quiet, it was very fast, and also quite precise. Of course, this depends always with which camera you use it. I used it with the Z8. I could also have used the Z9. This would have given me similar results. I just found like the Z8 is a nicer partner in terms of weight and overall handling. I feel the Z9, especially for this lens, a bit bulky, but anyway, the results will be very similar if you have a Z9. So I had very different situations. I was starting in the beginning to shoot some ducks and other waterfowl that were swimming or maybe walking over a meadow. There I had zero problem with the autofocus. Really, it was snappy, it sticked on the subject. I was very impressed. But it was maybe not the hardest test. So then I went to the forest, I took pictures of nutcrackers, tits and other songbirds, and there I was really positively surprised. It felt like it was detecting the eye of the animal better than the 600mm f4. And I was really, positively surprised. And then it got me thinking that I actually already observed something similar with my Canon lenses, that this big super tailors with this large aperture and therefore shallow depth of field can have a bit more trouble in detecting a subject if it's really blurred. So actually here, I think with this lens you have an edge in these situations. I still want to mention, if the subject was completely blurred, meaning you were focused on infinity, you had a tit like 4, 5, 6 meters in front of you, the animal eye detection would not detect it, and even with the spot autofocus sometimes it would not work. I also had this with other cameras. This is happening with Sony, and I know it from my Canon system. This is quite common. So what I usually do here is use the manual focus to just pre-focus, to bring it more or less in the same focal plane. And this can mean if the tit is at 5 meters, I focus anywhere between 3 and 10 meters, and then the eye detection will usually get it. And what I found really nice here in comparison to the old 200 to 500 millimeter is that you have this electronic manual focus, meaning you can not only set the direction you want to focus, which is nice for me as a Canon shooter that I don't need to think to turn it the other way, but you can also decide how quickly it should shift the focus from infinity to the near focus distance. And this is really handy because I don't really use manual focus for this type of photography. I just use it to quickly throw the focus closer to the subject, that then the autofocus can take over again. And here you have these settings like 90 degree or 120. I was a bit switching between the two, and I really enjoyed this. So I think Nikon did a very good implementation of this in the firmware, in my opinion, better than Canon. Next, I was even higher in the mountains over the timberline, taking pictures of ptarmigan, chamois and ibex. And here I was really struggling with the autofocus. I went to smaller zones to make it easier for the camera to detect the eye, but especially the ptarmigan, I was a bit disappointed that it didn't manage so well. The thing is, I don't think this is the lens, I think it's more the camera, where it's the same for birds in flight, where Canon just seems to have a clear edge on the detection of the subject. Once it had the subject, it was tracking it perfectly. There was none of this pumping of the focus or anything. This was all smooth. Just for the detection, I needed to go to the back to the spot autofocus a couple of times or manually pre-focus. So here I was struggling a bit more. And as I said before, here this manual focus ring was a really big help. I felt that overall the autofocus was a bit more consistent than with the 200 to 500, and especially much quicker. I think you can see this in this clip. I was changing the focus or focusing between the reeds that were like 50 meters away and this kind of ruler for the water level that was a bit closer, maybe 6 meters or something. And you can see that the 200 to 500 seems rather slow if you afterwards compare it to the 180 to 600 millimeter lens. So how well is this lens doing with tele-extenders? I already showed you the sharpen test before, but this was studio test, so how well does it work in the field? So first of all, I only tested the 1.4 extender, which gives you a 250 to 840 millimeter f8 to f9 lens. And I need to say, overall, the autofocus was still performing very well. I felt if it was getting darker, a bit low contrasty scenes, it was struggling a bit more. And I think maybe this is the reason, I'm not sure, but in some situations the performance really dropped, and I had series where none of the images were really sharp. They all seemed a bit soft, and I could not really explain it. And this very rarely happened without the extender. Sometimes maybe it happened, but with the extender way more often and also more pronounced, that the images were just lacking a bit of sharpness. So I'm not saying don't use the extender, I would just really think about when you use it. I felt like a Nikon 400mm f4.5 or the 600mm f4 are just taking the extender much better. I think here it can be useful if you want to take some portraits and the 600mm are just enough, not enough. You're fairly close to the subject, but you want to crop in a bit tighter, then it can be nice, especially if you have enough light. Sometimes they still worked with not so much light, but I needed to push the ISO a bit more because I preferred to stop down to f10 in these situations. And what helped me here was my usual workflow with DxO Puro. In some situations it also helped to get out a bit more sharpness of the files. You can see a before and after here. And if you're interested, there is a free trial below. So to conclude, how happy was I with the lens? Well, overall very happy. I think it's offering a solid performance, a good sharpness, nice flexibility, still a kind of lightweight package to a very reasonable price. I think you need to acknowledge that it's not an S-line lens. It performs very well, but if I compare it to a 400mm f4.5, the S lens, I just felt that this one is a bit more consistent in the performance. It's a bit sharper and it takes tele-extenders much better. I'm mentioning this because I think if you're interested in this lens, I would also have a closer look at the 400mm f4. I just mentioned the different advantages and disadvantages. The 400mm f4 is more expensive, but it's also smaller and noticeably lighter. But due to the zoom, I think this is a very flexible lens and a very interesting choice if you're wanting to get a bit more serious about bird or wildlife photography in general. It still offers very nice image quality, so there it's a clear recommendation. I also think the upgrade from the 200 to 500 is really worth it if you have the money, because you get a much more consistent performance. It's a bit lighter, you have these internal zooms, the autofocus is better, and so on. So what if you already own a big super tele prime like a 600mm f4 and you want also to have some kind of zoom lens? I think here it's a bit more difficult to give a recommendation, because I think if you always take both lenses, this one is rather big and at some point it gets almost redundant with the 600mm. So I think there I would rather go for the Z100 to 400. Unfortunately, I could not test it, but I have heard from several photographers that were using that lens and this lens that the Z100 to 400 is just a bit sharper and it's of course much lighter. And if I have a 600mm and I want a second lens, I don't need one that also goes to 600mm. I think I would be fine with 100 to 400. However, if you already have a big prime and you want to buy this because you say for some trips you might not take the big prime, then this is again a fantastic lens and will probably give you very nice images in many situations. If you want to pick up this lens or maybe a tele-extender, I would be very happy if you would use the affiliate link below. It would just help to support my channel. You can also do this, of course, by giving a super thanks or by buying me a coffee or a beer over the link below.